On the 18th of February 2011, British alternative rock band Radiohead released their massively anticipated 8th album, The King of Limbs.
There are a lot of songs on here that just underwhelm me.
But then we got The King of Limbs, the worst Radiohead album.
And dials down traditional songwriting to the point where a lot of these songs barely even have what you'd call melodies.
8 songs, 37 minutes long, kind of an insignificant release, to be honest.
The album was released completely independently to any record label or contract, and was initially only available as a download on the Radiohead website. Its success, however, was essentially overshadowed by what had come before. 4 years earlier, In Rainbows was released, and saw incredible praise and was highly successful, one reason being because it released in a similar way, the first of Radiohead's albums to be released independently, marking a new era for the band and their discography, breaking the restraints put on the band's music by their contract with EMI, allowing them to release it whenever they wanted, for whatever price they wanted. The pay-what-you-want model was revolutionary, letting anyone buy the album for any price, including downloading it for free. This was a choice that led to massive success, with In Rainbows selling more than 1.7 million copies in the space of a year, outselling the band's previous 2 major releases. In Rainbows, despite the creative liberties given to the band during recording and release, actually offered a very accessible and enjoyable sound. Each track offered intense emotion and narrative in terms of music and lyrics, being composed of vital elements of alternative rock, but in a more refined, honest, expressive and modern genre. The album challenged the likes of OK Computer, The Bends and Kid A to become what was to many their new favourite release. So, after 4 years of anticipation, casual listeners and fans alike were understandably taken off guard by the King of Limbs' more inaccessible and experimental sound, comprised of more rhythmic elements, loops and samples, as well as an overall length, tonal quality and musical style that didn't meet a lot of people's expectations. And in a complete polar opposite, many do deem this album to be less than good, some putting it right at the bottom of their list when it comes to Radiohead's discography. And I agree. You might have clicked on this video expecting me to defend The King of Limbs, or give it much needed praise, calling out how underrated it is, but no, in reality there is actually a lot that's wrong with the album itself, and the majority of people are right to critique it. Instead, I'm going to defend the songs themselves. The King of Limbs opens with Bloom, and instead of the catchy drum machine seen in 15 Step, or the signature guitar riffs that open such songs as Body Snatchers and Jigsaw Falling into Place, Bloom starts with a spacey, continuous sound that confuses and entrances the listener. I think it's a piano, but it's hard to tell from the first listen. It sets the tone for the rest of the album, repeated use of samples and electronic components which I personally enjoy, but might scare a lot of people away. Bloom is an incredibly melodic and pleasing song if you listen to each musical component closely. The bass, vocals, synths and brass instruments create an incredible overlapping melody, while the drums loudly echo and loop throughout the whole thing. One criticism I see for this album is that the drums are too loud and annoying, and not mixed properly with all the other elements present in the music. It's understandable though that a more experimental, rhythm-based album would incorporate complex drum loops into its tracks. Morning Mr. Magpie creates a similar drum pattern and a guitar loop that repeats throughout the whole song. It sounds quite cool at first, but genuinely becomes quite boring towards the end of the track. The same musical components dominate the entire 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and while it has a fairly conventional song structure, including a chorus of sorts, the song doesn't really change at all in terms of dynamics or tone. It demonstrates one of the main reasons why this album is so divisive. Songs like Morning Mr. Magpie and Little by Little are repetitive and monotonous, but aren't designed to fit the mould of a typically structured song, but to demonstrate the technologies and recording techniques that were used to make them, which is why it didn't meet the expectations of so many. They were expecting the former. Once you understand the reason why these songs sound this way, then you start to appreciate their sound and want to listen to them even more. If you didn't like the first 3 tracks, then you won't be redeemed by the next track, Feral. It's easily the most unconventional song on the album, being mostly percussion based, including a lot of indistinguishable electronic vocal samples. The track does have lyrics, but are very hard to make out, and Tom's voice is so edited and touched up that it blends in with all the other instruments and techniques used. Feral kind of sounds like the rest of the King of Limbs times 100, which again is either a really good thing or a really bad thing. It's immediately contrasted by Lotus Flower, which is easily the most listenable song here, and the only song from the album that had an official music video. Guaranteed it's just a clip of Tom York wearing a top hat and doing a dance, which was interestingly choreographed. The track is much more conventional and friendly to a new listener, not bombarding them with experimental and complex rhythms and loops that were seen earlier. Codex is a slower, more melancholy track that lowers the pace of the album dramatically, and to be honest, I don't have much to say about it, other than the fact that it's a really beautiful song that also manages to balance that with electronic samples and effects. The last two songs, Give Up the Ghost and Separator, are maybe slightly less scary than some of the other tracks. The former being calm and acoustic, still using background samples, but this time they're much more subtle, and it only really features a guitar and simple vocals. There's nothing incredible or stunning about it, but that's good, letting it own its calmer and more somber nature. Finally, Separator takes us back to the beginning of the album slightly, using a repeated guitar motif before using a piano melody. The King of Limbs ends with the use of conventional instruments and structures that we're used to, while still obviously carrying its signature style of experimentation. The fact that the last half of the album is more conventional and easy to listen to for people who perhaps aren't used to the weirder songs just makes me think, maybe the King of Limbs would have worked better backwards. Hear me out on this one. If I was somehow in charge of the track placements on the album, I'd consider putting the last half first and the first half after that, or at least keeping it relatively the same, but still starting with something like Separator or Lotus Flower. I think some might have been put off with the first four being the more experimental ones, and might have stopped listening or have only remembered the album for the first few songs. The opening tracks provide first expectations for the rest of the album, and while of course I still adore and appreciate every number on the release, this decision might have made the King of Limbs synonymous with the repeating loops, percussion and electronic samples that on a surface level could be seen as quite uninteresting. Though, if we are going to play God and completely reimagine the King of Limbs, we should probably look at some of the other releases that Radiohead were responsible for at the time. Two more singles were released by the band in 2011, the first, Super Collider, being recorded in the same sessions as the album, but released separately for Record Store Day of that year. The song also uses synthesizers, but in a more straightforward way, alongside pianos and drums. It overall presents a catchy and memorable tune, alongside a repeated hook in the lyrics. The next single released was The Daily Mail, a slower song, but again is more straightforward and conventional, whilst being incredibly emotive, almost like videotape, and at the ending of the song exploding into a crescendo of drums and brass instruments, accompanied by louder and more aggressive vocals, the dynamics reminded me almost of Karma Police from OK Computer. The King of Limbs might have done so much better if these singles were included on the final album. It would fix the problem of the album's length being too short, boosting it from 8 to 10 tracks. It would also give it a more musical variety, giving the listener a break from the chaotic, overproduced and experimental tracks to listen to something more melodic and emotional. No singles were released from the tracklist of The King of Limbs, perhaps undermining it as a strong component of Radiohead's discography, so these might provide the fundamental sonic backbone that the album probably needed upon its release. As I mentioned earlier, these songs are all good, but it's just the way that they were produced, mixed and released on the album which is the problem. It's only when these songs are performed live when you can hear how good they really are. Thankfully, a fully live version is available in the form of The King of Limbs Live from the Basement. The band already did this with In Rainbows, but to be completely honest, I prefer this one. It acts as a re-recording or a live remaster of the album, as playing these songs live makes them infinitely better than the album version. You get to see and hear all the musical intricacies being played together and recorded at the same time. The issue people note about The King of Limbs being mixed poorly isn't present here, as it's all being mixed live. Certain elements like the drums don't stand out jarringly like they do on the album version, as they blend in with all the other instruments. Because they don't go through such a massive level of production, each song sounds more natural and raw. The From the Basement version also includes a version of Super Collider and The Daily Mail, along with its B-side Staircase. To me, this is the definitive version of The King of Limbs, not just for the reason already mentioned, but because these songs were made to be played live. There's nothing wrong with these tracks themselves, only the way in which they were mixed, produced and released. They have the potential to be great, just not in the album format. I hope after watching this video, whether you've listened to the album before, that you might be able to go back to it, or listen to it for the first time, and finally appreciate it. There are, however, countless people who do already appreciate it, and while it may be endlessly deemed to be Radiohead's worst album, it can also be a fan favourite.
First time in Well, for the first time, we're going to try and play some King of Limbs and shit. So, we're still trying to figure it out, so sing along, help us out, alright?